Well, thank you very much. I'm going to talk about a little bit about tax policy, and it's appropriate since I was at a conference, and I'm in New York City, and I was at a conference today put on by the Bush Institute, featuring a lot of speakers ranging from Paul Ryan to Governor Chris Christie, former President Bush himself, all talking about what the implications would be for the country if all these tax rates go up next year, which is what is going to happen automatically unless the law is changed. Now, ultimately, of course, what we should have is a flat tax. But the question is, are we moving in the right direction toward tax reform, or are we moving in the wrong direction? And the key principles of tax policy, this would probably be a good way to start my remarks, is by explaining that the things that you want in a tax code are to have the lowest possible tax rate. Because what is a tax rate? A tax rate is the price that government is imposing on whatever behavior is being taxed. And the politicians understand this when they want to. For instance, when they raise tobacco taxes, they understand that they're raising tobacco taxes because they want to reduce tobacco consumption. Now, I might not agree with them on that policy, but I give them an A+ for economics, because they're right. The higher the tax on tobacco, the less smoking that you have. What frustrates me is that they forget that lesson or deliberately ignore that lesson when it comes to taxes on work, saving, investment, risk-taking, entrepreneurship, the things that make an economy grow faster, that make an economy more likely to create jobs, to be competitive. So we want tax rates to be as low as possible, but that's just one of the things that you should strive for in a pro-growth tax system. You also want to avoid double taxation of saving and investing. In our tax code in America, between the capital gains tax, the corporate income tax, the double tax on dividends, and the death tax, we have a single dollar of income taxed as many as 4 different times. And for those of you who saw on the news today that Obama was out talking about the so-called Buffett rule, the Buffett rule, the entire purpose of that is to increase the double taxation on both dividends and capital gains. And when you consider the fact that all that income is already subject to the 35% corporate income tax, which is the highest corporate income tax in the industrialized world, you can see that it's not just a question of having a low tax rate. You also don't want to tax income 2, 3, 4 times, because then the effective tax rate, as economists would say, the effective tax rate can become very, very confiscatory. And then a third principle of good tax policy is you want to get rid of corrupt loopholes. You want to make sure that the government isn't trying to engage in industrial policy through the tax system. You want everything to be treated the same so that the government's not tilting the playing field in ways that are luring people into making economic choices that are irrational. So that's really what the whole purpose of different tax preferences and loopholes and exclusions and shelters and deductions is all about. It's about the government imposing a low rate or a 0 rate on some activities, but then a very high rate on other activities, and that causes people to make decisions that are not good for the economy. I mean, it's good for lowering your tax bill, but what we want is the market, the free market, to determine the allocation of resources. And those are really the 3 big principles of tax policy. There are other things that are important. You want your tax system to be territorial so that you're not taxing things that occur in other countries, because that's the business of other countries to tax. But really, a low rate, no double taxation, and no loopholes. You do all of those things, and you're going to have a very simple, low-rate, consumption-based tax. Now, what does consumption-based tax mean? It's simply a public finance economist term that means you're only taxing income one time. Now, you can achieve that a couple of different ways. You can have a low-rate, consumption-based flat tax, or you can have a low-rate, consumption-based national sales tax or fair tax. They're really different sides of the same coin. A flat tax taxes your income one time at one low rate when you earn it, and a sales tax taxes your income one time at one low rate when you spend it. But either one of those systems is the theoretically ideal, correct tax system that you want in your economy. Now, of course, there's an entirely separate question: what size government are you trying to finance? Because Sweden actually has a pretty good tax system, considering that they're having to collect more than 50% of their economic output to finance government. So by definition, even though their tax system, the structure of it, isn't that bad, the fact that government is more than 50% of GDP means that their tax system winds up being bad just in terms of the total amount that they have to take out of the economy. So one simple rule of thumb for tax policy is, if you have a very big bloated government like some of the European welfare states, it's impossible to have a good tax system. And if you have a very small government, like our founding fathers envisioned, and like we had in our country for more than 150 years, 2/3 of our nation's history, we actually had a very small federal government in Washington. And when you had that, you didn't need an income tax or a sales tax, and you could finance government with just a handful of small taxes. So really the key thing, if we want tax reform, if we want a modest tax burden, if we want any sort of good reform, we need to figure out how to take this bloated government that we have right now, which if we leave it alone, it's going to become like Greece as we get into the baby boom generation retiring, we'll lose. There's no way we'll have good taxation if we don't figure out some way to reform the entitlements and shrink the federal government back to what our founding fathers envisioned. But again, the principle that I'm trying to get across is small government, easy to have a good tax code; big government, impossible to have a good tax code. So that's sort of where we want to ultimately wind up someday, with a single rate consumption-based tax like a flat tax. Now, let me go ahead and preempt one of the questions that I always get. Someone always says, why not go with a fair tax or a national sales tax? And that's perfectly fine. I put most of my effort on a flat tax for one simple reason: I don't trust politicians. And if we do a fair tax or a national sales tax, the only way I would want to do that is if we change the Constitution so that we repeal the 16th Amendment that allowed the income tax, not just repeal the 16th Amendment, but replace it with something so ironclad that even Justice Sotomayor can't rationalize it as an income tax. Now here's the problem. We can't get a 2/3 vote for a balanced budget amendment that's so watered down it's not even worth having. And so I don't think we're going to get a 2/3 vote to get that kind of constitutional amendment out of Congress. And my concern is, if we ever did a fair tax or a national sales tax or a value-added tax and we didn't get rid of the income tax, or we simply relied on politicians promising they would get rid of the income tax, it would never happen. And we would wind up like Europe, because if you look at the European experience, when they first put in their version of a national sales tax, the value-added tax, they always promised that they would be getting rid of or eliminating or reducing some other tax. But at the end of the day, when the dust settled, the value-added tax was an add-on tax that helped finance a much bigger government. That's really when the welfare state came to Europe. If you go back 40 years ago, when the European nations were first putting in their national sales taxes, government wasn't much bigger in Europe than it was in America at the time. But they put in the value-added tax, and then that enabled the explosion of the welfare state, and that, of course, has culminated in the disaster that you see in countries like Greece and Italy and Spain and Portugal, and that's going to spread. France, Belgium, all these countries have the same demographic problems. They all have the same overcommitments in terms of entitlements. And by the way, the U.S. is only 10 or 15 years behind, which underscores that we need to, as I said before, begin to deal with some of these programs. So any single rate consumption-based tax system is good. I think the flat tax is the most politically realistic because I worry about downside risk. The downside risk if we do a flat tax is that the politicians somehow degenerate us back to the current system. That wouldn't be good. But the downside risk of a national sales tax, if we haven't amended the Constitution, is that we become France. And then, I don't know, maybe we have to train our army to surrender if there's ever a war, so I don't want to go down that path. So let's now talk about what's happening in the current fiscal policy fight and put it in the context of whether we're moving in the direction of tax reform or whether we're moving away from tax reform. And we actually did have some pretty good tax changes last decade. We reduced marginal tax rates, not much, 6% to 35%. That was a modest but good step in the right direction. More importantly, we reduced the double taxation on dividends and capital gains down to 15%. And that was actually a fairly significant step in the right direction in terms of satisfying that key principle of reducing double taxation of income that is saved and invested. And by the way, the reason that's important, I should have said this before, every single economic theory, even socialism and Marxism, every single economic theory holds to the principle that you can't have long-run economic growth without more capital formation. What's capital formation? Saving and investing. Simply stated, you have to set aside some of your income today to finance tomorrow's growth. It's sort of like a farmer setting aside seed corn for next year's crop. And yet, the very act that every economist agrees you have to have capital formation, saving and investing for growth, and yet that's what we tax the heaviest in our country with all these extra layers of taxation, dividends, capital gains, death taxes, corporate taxes. These all wind up being taxes on the seed corn for economic growth in our society. So if I had to identify the best change that we had during the Bush years, it was the reduction of double taxation on dividends and capital gains. Although we did have, in 2010, there was no death tax. So for people who were planning ahead and died that year, that was very smart. Unfortunately, I managed to make it through the year, not that I had enough income or assets to worry about it anyhow, much to my children's disappointment. But here's where we are right now. We got to 2010 when those tax cuts were supposed to expire. We managed, even though the Democrats controlled everything that year, we managed to extend those tax cuts 2 years. But now at the end of this year, and of course it's the presidential election year, not only are those tax cuts supposed to expire, but this payroll tax holiday is supposed to expire. We also have higher capital gains and investment income taxes because of Obamacare, and we have the sequester coming January 1st, which I think is a good thing, but the special interest lobbies in Washington are horrified that we might have some automatic across-the-board cuts in the rate of growth of government spending. And we also have a debt limit, which is going to kick in sometime toward the end of the year, depending on how the economy goes for the next 7 or 8 months. It may happen a little bit before the election, it may happen afterwards. So basically, we are facing a big train wreck of all these different things happening at the end of the year. Now, let me preempt another question I'll get, because it's very easy, because my answer is going to be, I don't know. Someone's going to say, what's going to happen? To be frank, it probably depends on the election. If Obama wins, I think Republicans will be a little bit dispirited, and they may give in to Obama on things like the Buffett rule. They may give in to Obama on things like raising these top tax rates. We will probably see dividends and capital gains, more double taxation of them. On the other hand, if Romney wins, Republicans presumably will be more enthusiastic and will try to force through either a long-term extension or a permanent extension of those tax cuts. Now, then again, we have the tie situation. What if Obama wins re-election, but Republicans hold the House and win the Senate? Well, then your guess is going to be as good as mine in terms of what's going to happen to all those tax policies out there. And keep in mind, these are just the things that are going to happen automatically. Again, we're dealing with payroll taxes, we're dealing with the Bush tax cuts, especially what's happening to dividends and capital gains. But we also have the various changes that Obama has proposed. As I mentioned already, he was out there demagoguing today about the Buffett rule. We also have potential changes to Social Security taxation. Obama has wanted to eliminate what's called the wage-based cap. So you could see a 12.4 percentage point increase in the tax rate on investors, entrepreneurs, and small business owners. as part of a pro-tax increase way of trying to bail out Social Security. And the White House just today released some talking points where they favorably cited a study saying that the revenue maximizing tax rate is 73%. Now, I suppose we should be happy that they acknowledge that the Laffer curve exists, but we should be unhappy that they think the revenue maximizing tax rate is 73%. I think that's far, far too high. But even more important than that, what they don't understand, the key insight of the Laffer curve, is not that it identifies the point where tax rates should be. It simply identifies the point where the damage to the economy is so large that you no longer gain any revenue. But why would we ever want to get to that point? Would it really be worth it to give the politicians an extra dollar of revenue if we had to destroy $10 of private GDP? I had a post on my blog just this morning where I looked at some new research from an economist at the University of Chicago and another economist at the Federal Reserve. They had a joint study where they looked at the revenue maximizing tax rate in the US and different European countries. And according to these economists' data, the US could double tax rates on labor income to get to the revenue maximizing point, but it would do so much damage to the economy that there would be a 45% drop in taxable income. So think about that. Would it be worth it to maximize revenue for the government if all of us had to make do with 45% less income? Of course, that would be a terrible thing, but the White House, by citing that study and saying that it was I guess a guidepost for public policy, that indicates the mentality we have in Washington, where they're willing to make all of us less prosperous. They're willing to lower our living standards just to get a few additional crumbs of revenue that they can use to try to buy their way to re-election. And I think that's really the kind of ideology that we're dealing with. And I don't say this as a partisan point, because there's no question we've seen Republicans act like big spenders all through last decade. And thank goodness we got some new Tea Party members to try to bring the GOP back on the straight and narrow of fiscal responsibility. But a lot of the old bulls, as they call them, the committee chairmen, the appropriators, and things like that, they still have this mentality that you create wealth in Washington and that it's good for Washington to spend money. And so even though, since they've usually signed the no tax pledge, they know that it wouldn't be smart for them to say, yes, raise taxes. But nonetheless, I suspect many of them, in their heart of hearts, wouldn't object to more money coming to Washington because they have been in that town for a long time. And one thing you can say about long-term incumbents, maybe when they first came to Washington 20 years ago, they thought Washington was a cesspool. Now they think it's a hot tub. And they're part of the go-along to get-along crowd. And that's something that we have to watch out for is whether or not they get corrupted by being in a company town, and the company in Washington is big government. So let's now talk a little bit about what would be the best case scenario for fiscal policy and for tax reform. Well, obviously the best case on the spending side of the fiscal ledger would be something like the Ryan budget. For the last 10 years, I have been very critical of Republicans for being big spenders. During the Bush years, starting with the no bureaucrat left behind education bill and going all the way through TARP, there was just reckless spending that was very irresponsible. And a lot of the Republicans in Congress went along with it. Most of them, almost all of them, went along with it. But last year, many of those same Republicans, 2/3 of the GOP conference in the House were the incumbents. Only 1/3 were the new Tea Party freshmen. But every single one of those Republicans, except for 4 who actually thought the Ryan budget was too weak, every one of those Republicans last year went down to the floor of the House and voted for the Ryan budget, which contained the block granting of Medicaid to the states, which contained the modernization of Medicare, switching to what's called a premium support system, basically the same plan that members of Congress have, so you know it's not a bad plan. But those changes to Medicaid and Medicare would make a huge difference in the long run for our country's fiscal future on the spending side of the fiscal equation. Now, of course, the Senate hasn't done a budget for more than 3 years. We're at well over 1,000 days and counting. And Obama's budget was rejected by the Democrat-controlled Senate last year, 97-0, and it was rejected unanimously by the House this year, 414-0. So every single Democrat was voting against what Obama proposed. So Obama's MIA on the budget. The Senate is MIA on the budget. But we do have the House doing something very good and very admirable in terms of trying to address the entitlement program. Now, in theory, if there's a Republican president in the White House in 2013, maybe the Ryan budget would pass, assuming, of course, that Republicans control the Senate, or if they somehow found some moderate Democrats who were willing to go along with them. If they didn't, that's the optimistic scenario on the spending side of the budget. On the tax side of the budget, it's very hard to predict, because a lot of what has been, I guess, using up the oxygen or attracting all the attention on the tax side is what we've been talking about already, which is what happens to the Bush tax cut. It is possible that if you have a new Republican president, and maybe they've extended the Bush tax cuts from 2001 and 2003, maybe they'll extend them another year, and then the new president would be able to, in their first budget next year, propose something not just dealing with the Bush tax cuts, but maybe a more comprehensive reform. Now, Paul Ryan, he's talking about this dual rate system, 10%, 25%, that also deals with some of the double taxation in the tax code. I have no idea if Romney, if he wound up in the White House, whether he would make that his plan. For that matter, I have no idea whether Romney would actually ask Congress to give him the Ryan budget. That's a concern that a lot of people in Washington have, is that once Romney has the nomination, Republicans on Capitol Hill will automatically just defer to him. And if it's true that he's more moderate and he was just pretending to be conservative for the primary, then maybe we'll wind up with a much more modest milquetoast type package, in which case we wouldn't get those reforms on the entitlements. And if we don't get the reforms on the entitlements, we're never going to be able to get good tax policy, because we're going to wind up on this slow but steady drift toward European-sized government. And if you have European-sized government, you're going to have European-style tax policy. And if you have European-style tax policy, you're going to have European-style stagnation, high unemployment, stagnant living standards. And actually, the number one thing that we have to worry about, at least under this pessimistic scenario, the number one thing we have to worry about is a value-added tax. Because as I said before, it was the value-added tax that allowed the Europeans to go so far, so fast in the wrong direction. And one thing that concerns me, and to be honest, I'm concerned about it whether Obama wins re-election, and I'm concerned about it whether Romney wins the election. There are a lot of people in Washington who think, well, let's just slip this tax in. It's a hidden tax that's built into the price of products, and we'll get a lot more money from taxpayers, and that will enable us to sort of paper over the problem for a couple of years. But putting in a value-added tax would be like putting blood in the water with hungry sharks around. Or maybe the better analogy, if you'd be giving the keys to a liquor store to a bunch of alcoholics. If you give them a value-added tax, at that point, you might as well look for property in Costa Rica, because I really think we will have lost, and that the chances of us preserving American exceptionalism will dramatically shrink if the politicians have a bat, because if they have a bat, they won't feel the pressure to try to fix the entitlement programs. So what's going to happen in 2013 and beyond? I'm a policy wonk, and many of you probably have a better feel for what might happen politically than I do. But I know from the international evidence, I know from looking at what's happened in other countries around the world, that if we don't fix the entitlements, and if we give the politicians a bat, it really is a very, very grim situation. Let me go ahead and spend now just a couple of minutes talking about what's happened with the flat tax around the world, because maybe that's an optimistic way to close up my remarks. Then we'll get to the good part, which is the Q&A. When I first came to Washington back in the 1980s, I realize you all probably think I'm only 30, but I'm actually in my 50s. And when I first came to Washington in 1985, there were only 3 flat tax jurisdictions in the world at that point in time. And now we have almost 30. Alvin Rafushka actually says we have over 30, but we have a disagreement on certain jurisdictions and whether they should count. But we've had this dramatic explosion in the number of flat tax countries, mostly in the former communist world. Who would have thought? You know, when I came to Washington, we had the Soviet Union, the evil empire. Now we have Russia with a 13% flat tax. But it really started with the Baltic countries, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. They were the ones who first did the flat tax in the mid-1990s. Then it spread to Russia in 2001. And then we got countries like Slovakia, Bulgaria, Romania, Czech Republic, Mongolia, all around the world. But again, concentrated in the former Soviet bloc, we've had these flat tax countries spring up. And we're getting very good results. And what's most notable is the countries that are closer to the pure theory, the theoretical ideal of a flat tax, like Hong Kong, Slovakia, Estonia, those are the countries that have had the best results. Because a lot of countries, they put in a flat rate, but they might still have double taxation. They put in a flat rate, but they might still have some loopholes that distort behavior. But the countries that really do the flat tax the right way, and none of them, to be fair, none of them are down to the postcard. Even the good flat tax systems, you know, it's still one page back and forth. But the countries that are getting the closest to the theoretical flat tax are getting the best results. And what does that tell us? Well, it tells us everything that we've always learned through our own history, that when Coolidge cut taxes, when Kennedy cut taxes, when Reagan cut taxes, when we had lower tax rates, we had more growth. On the other hand, in the 30s, when Hoover and Roosevelt raised tax rates, the economy didn't do well. When we had bracket creep in the 1970s, with inflation pushing people into higher tax brackets, we didn't do well. So you know, we have our own history that shows us when the cost of government rises, we tend to have a weaker economy. And just like we have this international evidence, the countries that are theoretically the best are growing the fastest. The countries with the high tax rates and the onerous systems, like the European welfare states, they're the ones that are growing the slowest. So what I always say is that the world is a laboratory. And for that matter, our states are a laboratory. One of the things at this conference that I was at in New York City this morning is there was a panel with the governor. Chris Christie gave one of the keynote speeches, but then you had 3 governors, the governors of Tennessee, Maine, and Oklahoma. And they were all talking about the different tax rate reductions and tax reforms they were doing in their state. And there were people at the conference giving speeches about how the zero income tax states like Texas and Tennessee and Nevada, Florida, historically grow the fastest and create the most jobs. So our national history is a laboratory, our state history is a laboratory, what's happened around the world with different countries is a laboratory. The Hong Kong flat tax, I think, is especially amazing. It's more than 60 years old. And even after 60 years, the Hong Kong flat tax, the last count I saw from a couple of years ago, their entire tax code is only 157 pages long. The US tax code is 73,000 pages. I remember giving a speech in Slovakia a couple of years ago at the Economics University of Bratislava. And I was given this, you know, just a visual example that we had this 70,000 plus pages of tax law. And one of the professors at the Economics University in Bratislava, she pulls out a magazine and she says, "Oh, this is our tax code." And I say, "Wow, your entire income tax is only that big?" And she said, "No, that's our entire tax code. Excise taxes, gasoline taxes, value-added tax, payroll taxes." She opens up this magazine-sized thing and she finds about 20 pages and she says, "That's our flat tax." So you can, if you are like Slovakia, if you are like Hong Kong, if you really do the flat tax right, you really can clean out the stables of all the corruption, all the loopholes, all the special deals, the exclusions, the exemptions, the deductions, the preferences, all the stuff that makes the lobbyists in Washington rich. You can get rid of all that if you follow the model that some countries have successfully implemented. And again, those are the countries that are growing the fastest. Now, I want to stress in conclusion here, we have to make sure that we keep our eye on the ball. And the ball that I'm talking about is the size of government. Because one of the reasons why Hong Kong is probably the best role model in the world is that they have kept government spending under control, usually averaging less than 20% of GDP, which, by the way, I think is too high. For much of our nation's history, total government spending, including federal, state, and local, was 10% of GDP. So I think Hong Kong's government is too high, but Hong Kong is 20% or a little bit under. We're close to 40% now. And some of the European welfare states are over 50%. And by the way, if we don't fix the entitlements, we're going to surpass those European welfare states. According to the long-run numbers for the Congressional Budget Office, we're going to have a federal government alone of almost 50% of GDP, and then you add in 15% for state and local government, we'd be worse than Greece, Italy, Spain, Denmark, Sweden, France. I guess we wouldn't be as bad as Cuba and North Korea, but we would really be in uncharted territory. And with a government that big, well, let me go ahead and close with a line that Chris Christie used at the conference today in New York. He said, if we continue down, and I'm going to paraphrase, of course, if we continue down the path of a paternalistic entitlement society, it won't just bankrupt us financially, it will bankrupt us morally. And that's really the key lesson. If you have a population, like you now have in Greece, that thinks it's the job of government to take care of them, to give them either government bureaucrat jobs where they don't do anything, or to give them welfare benefits, or to somehow, if you have a majority of your population riding in the wagon and a shrinking share of your population pulling the wagon, sooner or later the people pulling the wagon just say, forget it. And that's what we're seeing in Greece. The productive people are emigrating. They've already sent their money out of the country because they're worried about the greedy politician stealing the euro and putting in the worthless drachma. That's what you wind up with. It's almost like Atlas Shrugged come to life because the productive people are escaping, and then the looter class, all the moochers in the Greek society, are out rioting. It's the only place in the world where you have anti-government riots, but the rioters are government workers wanting more government. I don't know how to describe that other than I'm terrified that the same thing may happen to America. America right now is in better shape than Europe. If you look at the public opinion data, Americans still think that it's not the government's job to tuck you in bed at night and wipe the drool off your chin. The Europeans, though, they've sort of crossed the Rubicon. And I frankly don't know how, in the long run, those countries will survive. Matter of fact, I'll make a prediction that 10 years from now, there really won't be something resembling democracy in Greece. They'll basically be a protectorate of Brussels or Berlin. But then, 15 years from now, other countries in Europe, the ones that look good right now, they're going to be in trouble themselves. So we see what works around the world, and just as important, we see what doesn't work. And right now, if we don't fix the entitlement program, we're going to wind up like Greece. If we don't fix the entitlement program, we can kiss goodbye any chance to have good tax policy. And if we ever allow a value-added tax, well, as I said before, that's when you better start looking for property in Costa Rica, because America, as we know and love it, unfortunately, I think would be doomed. So with that cheerful conclusion,
Warren Buffett seems very enthusiastic about saying that the tax code is unfair and that 30% would be a fair tax for or dividends of individuals. How would you react if Paul Ryan were to suggest that any discussion of that 30% tax for individuals on dividends also apply to corporations? Berkshire Hathaway receives, I believe, about an 8% dividends received credit, which translates into an effective tax rate on its dividend income, which is considerable, of about 6.5% of the federal level. And perhaps that should be part of the discussion that Paul Ryan suggests, well, let's make this apply to corporation dividends going forward.
Rick, I didn't quite hear. I know Warren Buffett, Paul Ryan, Berkshire Hathaway, but if maybe you could, either I need a microphone or louder talking, if you could just rephrase that question.
Yeah, basically the thrust of the question is, if Buffett wants the Buffett rule, why not apply it to corporations also? Because his corporations have about 80% of their dividend income excluded under the dividend exclusion. So if it's such a wonderful thing, why don't we tax his companies the same way?
Well, Warren Buffett is a big giant hypocrite on this because nothing government if he wants to. And Warren Buffett is either dishonest or clueless about tax policy because his marginal tax rate is much, much higher than his secretary. And I really wish Republicans would call him out on that. Call him out on both things. The fact that he's misrepresenting the tax data and that if he really thinks that government spends money better than he does, he should write a check. But I agree with there's political hay to be made. Next time Warren Buffett comes up to the Hill, someone should ask him, not only these questions about why don't you pay more taxes, but why don't we have some sort of Buffett rule for entities like Berkshire Hathaway? Berkshire Hathaway, by the way, is in a billion-dollar fight with the IRS, where they are trying not to pay extra taxes. So again, I think Buffett is, I think he's become as economists would say, a rent seeker, a special interest beneficiary in recent years, and I think he's just sucking up to the political class so that he can continue to benefit from some of his investments. He made $5 billion on the Goldman Sachs bailout deal because he had the insider knowledge that the government was going to do the bailout. And if that's how you're making your money, you're not a capitalist. You're like a character out of Atlas Shrugged.
Okay, let's step right up to this Dan. Microphone, right there.
Hey Dan, I'm a big fan of Cato and I read your blog on a daily basis, and I hear you talking about how if we're going to have a good tax policy, we need to have an appropriate sized government. And at the same time, I hear you complimenting the Ryan budget, which of course is one of the most bold plans coming out of Washington in a long time. But even the Paul Ryan budget doesn't hit primary balance, which is that nonsense that he and Obama both play into, which is primary balance is balance if you don't include interest on the debt. And then balance a lot later after that, which of course most of the people, including me in this room, would be dead by the time that happens. And I've heard Paul Ryan's argument that he's subject to static scoring and that he believes that the economy would grow a lot greater and he would balance sooner. But why don't you endorse a budget like the Republican Study Committee or the Tea Party senators, the Rand Paul, Mike Lee, Jim DeMint budgets that have been proposed that balance in like 5 or 10 years? Because that's, I think, what business people in this room would understand.
That's a great question because if you look at the Paul Ryan budget, on average, government spending would increase by 3.1% a year, at least over the next 10 years. And if you want to balance the budget in 10 years, you need to basically hold government spending to 2% a year. And 3.1% a year is faster than inflation. It's also faster than last year's Ryan budget, which allowed spending to grow 2.8% a year. So he has slipped a little bit. And yeah, let's be honest. Paul Ryan's budget, while it's bold especially compared to what Republicans were doing during the Bush years, it's a bold step in the right direction. but it's not as good as the Republican Study Committee budget. It's not as good as Rand Paul's budget. Both of those budgets basically hold government spending to, I think it was about 1.8% a year. But actually, I did post on my blog about both the Rand Paul budget and the Study Committee budget, and I had the calculation in those blog posts, but I don't remember them right offhand. Now, here's really the key thing about fiscal policy, and I probably should have included this in my remarks. Our goal is not balancing the budget. Our goal is shrinking the federal government so that we honor what the founding fathers envisioned in terms of a small central government. Now, if you focus on shrinking the federal government, sooner or later, obviously, you will balance the budget. And I have what I call Mitchell's golden rule. I want to try to be like Art Laffer, have something for people to remember me by. Mitchell's golden rule is that the private sector should grow faster than the government. And if you have some rule like that, that basically forces government spending to grow by a relatively modest amount. And Paul Ryan's plan does satisfy that rule. It doesn't satisfy it as strongly as the Rand Paul budget, or as strongly as the Republican Study Committee budget, but I don't know, maybe I'm grading on a curve, but after 8 years of Republican big spenders during the Bush years, I'm just happy that at least they're on the right side of that golden rule. They're holding government spending so it grows slower than the private sector. Obviously, the more they can control government spending, the closer they get from 3.1 to 2.2 to 1.8 or even a freeze. I mean, you look at some of the countries around the world. Look at what Canada did between 1992 and 1997. They limited government spending to 1% a year growth. What happened? They went from having a deficit of 9% of GDP in 1992 to a surplus in 1997. So they had a deficit similar to what we have right now as a share of GDP. And by focusing on controlling government spending, they got rid of the deficit in 5 years. New Zealand, between 1990 and 1995, they held government spending to a flat freeze. And they went from having a big budget deficit to having a big budget surplus. So if we focus on the underlying disease of government spending, we'll cure the symptom of government borrowing.
Hi, Daniel. I want to allude to your reference to VAT in Europe. Having lived in England for 50 years, I'm very familiar with VAT and have seen it increase tremendously. From originally it was like 10%, now it's 20%, and it's an easy cash cow for government. It's an easy thing to collect, it produces a lot of revenue, and my question is, if we get stuck with Obama healthcare, how is that going to be funded? Because in England, it's a bottomless pit. Government are just pouring money into it, and the service doesn't improve. The NHS just gets worse. And I'm just wondering, if we have Obama healthcare, how do you see it being funded? Are we going to get VAT sort of under the radar in some shape or form?
Well, I worry we're going to get VAT no matter what if we don't deal with the entitlements. I guess two reasons to be optimistic. Number one, when all of you go home at night and you say your bedtime prayers, throw in a little prayer that Anthony Kennedy wakes up on the right side of the bed and is deciding oath that Obamacare is unconstitutional. But even if that doesn't happen, even if the Supreme Court decides that the 10th Amendment and the Enumerated Powers Clause have no meaning whatsoever, that'll obviously be a dark day in legal history. But even if that happens, I think we can still deal with Obamacare, because let's say Obama wins re-election and the Supreme Court does the wrong thing. So we're in 2016. Somebody like Senator Rubio runs for the presidency, he wins, let's assume that he has a Republican House and Senate. There's absolutely no reason why you can't deal with Obamacare by just including it in the Medicaid block grant. So I actually think that we have a mechanism to dismantle Obamacare as part of the block granting of Medicaid, which, by the way, is based on the very successful model of block granting welfare in the 1990s. So all hope is not lost. Now, on the other hand, if we don't elect somebody good at some point, and if Obamacare goes into effect, becomes ingrained in the American political culture, then yes, we will get it back. Sooner or later, the politicians will overcome the opposition, and they'll put it in, and then as I said before, I mean, you emigrated from the UK to the US, get that property in Costa Rica, because it really will be a grim situation.
Okay. Other questions? Well, yeah, go ahead.
So you mentioned earlier, Obama was talking about the Buffett rule earlier today. I also heard him say this election is going to be an election on tax fairness. Obviously, fairness being slightly different in his opinion versus ours. What do you see the election of this year being on, and if tax fairness is going to be, you know, the Democrats' campaign and economic inequality, what are some arguments we can bring to the more independent voters as the election heats up?
Well, that's another good question. I was actually on Neil Caputo's show earlier today, and off camera we were talking about this, and I told Neil that if I was a Democratic political consultant, I would do exactly what Obama's doing, or that's what I would be advising, because I think Mitt Romney is just not well suited to deal with that kind of attack. And so I think we're going to get class warfare 24/7 between now and the election. We're going to see all sorts of demagoguery on Maine Capitol. And if Romney and his people don't figure out a way of dealing with that, you might as well just call the election right now. So Obama is going in completely 100% on class warfare. If Steve Forbes or some other rich guy who was a genuine capitalist was running, I think they would be able to give a growth message, because I think growth trumps class warfare. But if Romney's too timid and doesn't have a good response, I don't think that bodes well. I think if I was advising Romney, I would say he has to be aggressive on growth. He has to point out that big government is just an inherently corrupting institution. He has to point out that Obama's agenda means that America becomes Greece. I think there are all sorts of very effective arguments to be made against Obama. Whether or not Romney makes them is anybody's guess.
Notice Chuck's button, by the way.
Defender of capitalism. Dan, I've seen you on CNBC and Fox in the last couple of days, and congratulations. I don't know how you get from one station to the other. I do have this question that bothers me a lot. We talk about the Ryan plan. We talk about Bowles-Simpson. I'm going to tell you that, in my opinion, the chances of either one of those or any other plan like them of succeeding and being enacted under a likely political scenario in the next 4 years is de minimis. I don't think it's going to happen. If that's the case, and you know, we're talking about all these long time frames, what does the country look like in 4 years if things continue as they are without this magic bullet of Bowles-Simpson or Ryan? Thank you.
The first thing I would say is that you don't want to put Bowles-Simpson in the same category as Ryan, because Bowles-Simpson has a big tax increase. Now, it's a much better tax increase than what Obama's pushing, because it's basically a tax increase in the guise of tax reform. The simple way to think about it is they're going to lower your rate by $1, and they're going to take away $2 in deductions and increase double taxation. That's better than Obama, who just wants to take away $3 and leave you with nothing. But Bowles-Simpson does not have the good entitlement reform of the Ryan budget. Bowles-Simpson increases double taxation. So there are some big problems with Bowles-Simpson. Again, it's better than Obama, but Bowles-Simpson is moderate left. Obama is radical left. Ryan is moderate right. The Cato Institute is radical right. Constitution, founding fathers. So that's a little commercial for the Cato Institute. By the way, another commercial for the Cato Institute. Randy Barnett, the lawyer who developed the arguments that were used in the Supreme Court and looks like might actually, fingers crossed, lead to a restoration of the Constitution. Randy Barnett has been a long-time Cato adjunct fellow, so the aggressive, principled positions sometimes do pay off in the long run, and I'm very proud that Cato has played a role in that. But anyhow, let's get to the crux of your question. Is there any hope in the next 4 years? No. If Obama wins re-election, the odds of the Ryan budget are 0. If Romney wins the election, I suspect the odds of the Ryan budget, well, something called the Ryan budget might go through, but I suspect it would be greatly watered down. At best, maybe we would do the Medicaid reform. I don't think we would do the Medicare reform. So it would be we'd maybe take, go 25% of the way in the direction we need to go in. But since I think that the odds are pretty strong that Obama wins re-election, obviously you have to weight the 0 a lot higher than the 25%. But that doesn't mean that hope is lost. If Obama wins re-election, I think that actually dramatically increases the chances of getting somebody like Rubio in 2016. And it probably dramatically increases the chances of having a good conservative-dominated House and Senate going into 2016. And given that we probably have 20, 25 years before we reach our Greek fiscal crisis, it's obviously not good that we would waste 4 years. But if Obama wins, it's going to be gridlock. I don't think he has the power to move things in the wrong direction, because in all likelihood, Republicans still control the House, and Republicans probably control the Senate. But even if they don't control the Senate, they'll have enough to filibuster whatever Obama wants to do. So 4 years with Obama and gridlock at least means we're not moving more in the wrong direction, at least above and beyond what's already built into the law. So yes, it would be better to fix all these problems now. Heck, it would have been better to fix the problem 20 years ago. It would have been better never to cause the problem. But I do think we have a little bit of time, and so I wouldn't quite, I wouldn't move everything to Costa Rica quite yet.
Thank you.
Here we go.
Hi, Dan. Hi, Dan. Thank you. I'm intrigued by the simplicity of the flat tax, but we talk about ending all sorts of loopholes. But the flip side of loopholes are certain deductions, say middle class things like mortgage interest deduction. So, what deductions or loopholes in a flat tax would you be willing to keep, or you advocate keeping, and which ones would go?
The only loophole that I would favor in a flat tax is the family-based allowance. So obviously, if you're a single filer, maybe your first $10,000 is tax-free. If you're a family of 4, I think the Army plan and the Steve Forbes plan was something like $30,000 would be tax-free. But above that, every dollar of income would be taxed only one time, but at that whatever the flat tax rate would be. Now, people say, well, what does that mean for the charitable deduction? Well, it's gone. But if you look at all the academic evidence on charitable giving, it's dominated by 2 things: people's wealth and people's disposable income. And both of those things would improve under a flat tax. And heck, look at the 1980s. When Ronald Reagan took office, the top tax rate was 70%. And that meant the value of the charitable deduction was 70 cents on the dollar. So it only cost you 30 cents as a rich person to give $1 to charity back in 1980. By 1988, it cost a rich person 72 cents to give $1 to charity because the rate was down to 28%. Yet we saw an explosion of charitable giving in the 1980s. Why? Because wealth increased and disposable income increased. So I don't think that the charitable contribution deduction makes a big difference for charitable giving. Now, if we got rid of it, but kept all the high tax rates and all the double taxation, yeah, it would probably have a negative effect. But remember, with flat tax, you're doing all these good things at the same time that you're getting rid of the deductions. On the state and local tax deduction, I want to get rid of it because I don't think the people of Colorado and Texas should be subsidizing high taxes in New York and California. Pretty simple. And on the home mortgage interest deduction, we're getting rid of it, but we're getting rid of it at the same time we're getting rid of the double taxation of interest income. So you really have to ask yourself, do you want a deductible mortgage of 6% or a non-deductible mortgage of 4%? It's 6 of one, half dozen of another. Think about it this way. Under a flat tax, all interest is treated the same way as municipal bonds are today. That means a lower interest rate. So I don't care. Grandfather existing mortgages and let people continue to have their 6% mortgages and get interest deductibility. The rest of us can have 4.5% mortgages with no deductibility. So I think I've spoken to the National Association of Realtors, I've spoken to the National Association of Home Builders, and whenever I go to those conventions and speak about this and I explain what happens, they realize it's not a threat at all. Now, politically, it might still be a problem getting that through, but if we ever get it through, I think the housing sector, like the charitable sector, will be in just fine shape with a flat tax.
Let me ask a follow-up to that, Dan. In the case of business income, how would that be calculated under the flat tax? So I run a law firm. Do I get to deduct my expense for paper clips?
Under a flat tax, every single business entity, whether it's a hot dog stand, a law firm, Microsoft, doesn't matter, everyone would use the same postcard, assuming we actually got the pure version. What you would do is put your gross receipts on line 1. You would then subtract out all your investments, all the wages you pay your workers, all your raw materials. What's left is your taxable income, and you pay whatever the flat tax rate is on that. It's a very, very simple system. It's basically a cash flow expenditure tax to businesses. How much money do you take in? How much money do you spend? The difference is your taxable income. With a couple of little wrinkles, fringe benefits aren't deductible anymore. So things like employee health insurance policies would be taxed sort of via a withholding tax at the business level. But that would be a great piece of healthcare reform because it would begin the transition to catastrophic insurance instead of this prepaid all-you-can-eat approach that we have to healthcare right now.
Okay. Any questions?
I got one.
I was just wondering, how is the tax policy in Costa Rica?
Well, actually, both Panama and Costa Rica have these favorable tax rules for expats. I've spoken in both countries to groups of overseas Americans that have basically gone down there, gone off the grid, and are living very comfortable lives, much higher living standards at the same level of income. Now, obviously, those people made their money first and then escaped across the border. If you didn't have your money first, it might not be a great place to earn a lot of money.
How do you get your
But they do have these very favorable rules. I don't know exactly what they are. I just know that they're attractive enough that lots of Americans have moved down there. But whenever I speak in places like Switzerland or Hong Kong or Singapore, I always run across Americans that have either officially or unofficially dropped out of sight from the IRS because they feel that they're being treated better in places like that.
So will you always be able to get your money out of the country to those places?
Well, it depends on whether you're doing it legally or under the cover of darkness. The Americans that do it in a way that doesn't make the IRS happy, what they do is over time, they shift their assets to foreign institutions, and they make sure that they then divest themselves of American stocks and purchase foreign stocks and foreign bonds and things like that. So if you have all your assets in a foreign institution and they're invested in foreign securities, and then you move to Costa Rica or Cayman or wherever, basically the IRS can't do anything about it. Now, of course, if you do it in a very public way and you're thumbing your nose at the IRS and then you come back to visit your children or grandchildren or something like that, you might end up in a little bit of trouble. So the people who have done this, who have dropped off the grid in the non-legal way, they do it very, very quietly so that they don't run into those problems.
Thank you.
Last question, man.
All right, better be a good one.
No pressure.
We can talk about the retirement issue in Panama later, but anyway, flat tax, as I've read, just shy 50% of the people pay zero income tax. So how do you get the political support when 50% of people aren't paying anything, as in zero tax rate, to support any kind of a flat tax, 10%, 15%, 20%?
Well, right now, almost half the population pays no income tax. Now, of course, they do pay payroll taxes and things like that. But if you do a flat tax, and you do this very generous family-based allowance like Dick Armey and Steve Forbes were talking about, well, then a lot of those people, almost all of them, aren't paying tax anyhow. So basically, you leave the non-tax paying half of the non-income tax paying share of the population unmolested, and you're simply reforming the income tax for the 50% of people who do pay the income tax. And actually, that's, I think, a criticism of the flat tax. Politically, it might be the realistic thing you have to do, but I think that right now we have too many people off the income tax rolls, and that's probably not healthy, because the more people you have in your country who think government is a free good, the more people who will probably think it's okay to have bigger government. And that's not what we want. Now, having said that, the odds of us getting a flat tax in the next 5 years are about the same as the odds of Rick's Oklahoma Sooners being a better football team than my Georgia Bulldogs. But I guess with that, that was the last question. I hope the transmission came through loud and clear, and I would invite people to look at my blog, International Liberty. Just go to Google, type in Dan Mitchell blog. I also have a whole set of videos on things like tax havens, tax competition, government spending, and I'm sure the folks at Steamboat can share those links if you need them.